Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to Conversations in the Digital Age. With me is our CUNY CUNY TV colleague, Bob Herbert. Bob Herbert was for 18 years an op-ed columnist with the New York Times of great distinction. He left the Times about 4 years ago, and he's written an intriguing, thought-provoking new book entitled Losing Our Way, an intimate portrait of a troubled America. The book has been an instant bestseller. It's been hailed by the Huffington Post as the most important book of the year. Bob, we're delighted to have you with us.
Jim, it's great to be here. Thank you.
And congratulations on your book. I'm always intrigued with titles of a book. And you know, your last column for the Times was called Losing Our Way. Why did you choose it, and have we lost our way?
Well, actually, the secret is I didn't choose it. I wanted to call this book Wounded Colossus. And the entire time I was working on it, you know, and people were talking to me about it, and I was saying, you know, and look for it, it's going to be coming out on Doubleday, Wounded Colossus. And then Doubleday, when it came time to the publication date was actually approaching, they were going, we can't sell a book called Wounded Colossus. So I'm thinking, you know, why not? I didn't understand why not, but they were adamant. And then finally they said, the headline on your last column was Losing Our Way, which I had chosen that headline. So then I said, fine, let's go with it. And now I think, you know, as I've made the rounds on the book tour and that sort of thing, I think they were correct. They apparently knew what they were talking about.
Great title, and Wounded Colossus is in the dustbin of history.
In the dustbin of history.
You have said that the United States, we here in America, need to be reimagined somehow, really reimagined, because Lyndon Johnson in 1964, which is kind of your benchmark, we were then he imagined a great society, an egalitarian society, and somehow or other we've lost that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, you know, I tell people as I go around to college campuses speaking to young people that, you know, I have a sister who's 4 years younger, and we grew up in what I think was the best time to grow up in America, and that was those early post-World War II decades. I mean, I'm a child of the 50s and the 60s, essentially. And, you know, so you come out of school, and jobs are easy to find. Higher education was affordable. You got benefits with jobs, you know, people believed in those days in pensions and that sort of thing. And I tell people it's not, you know, just nostalgia for a long time ago. I understand that there were all kinds of problems, that blacks and women were often treated hideously unfairly, you know, you know, I got drafted in the big build-up to Vietnam. I didn't have to go to Vietnam. They sent me to Korea, but, you know, you had the Vietnam War, so that was a great tragedy. So it's not that everything was wonderful, but you felt like you were making progress, that the country was getting better and better, and that you could rectify the things that you felt were wrong in this country. Now I feel that we're going backwards. We're backsliding. A perfect example of that is the way the Supreme Court has essentially eviscerated the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Very difficult to get decent jobs now. Kids come out of college with all kinds of college debt hanging over their shoulders and that sort of thing. And the reason I say the country needs to be reimagined is I don't think you can go back to the 1950s or 60s. Who would want to do that? So you want to take what was the best of that era and reimagine it for the 21st century, so that we get back to being much more of an egalitarian society, where you open wider the doors of opportunity and that sort of thing, where it's easier for a kid to get a decent education. So that's what I'm looking for.
Well, just to push you a little bit, the key to your argument is joblessness. Mm-hmm. And if families find themselves in hard times, this creates problems for their children, it creates problems for them, and so forth. But we did have a major financial crisis in 2008. There was fallout from that. We seem to be recovering. We're better off than Europe in many respects. We have seen the effects of globalization with job loss and jobs that have been replaced by technology. But the latest economic indicators are that jobless claims are down, and we're slowly getting back on our feet. Do you think that undercuts your argument that we have to reimagine ourselves?
No, not at all. I think that the monthly job numbers that we pay much too much attention to are very deceptive, that they don't give a good idea of the extent of the joblessness and underemployment that is out there. For one thing, people who have been out of the long-term unemployed, people who have been out of work for, say, 6 months or more, who have finally become just discouraged. They're not looking for a job anymore. They don't have a job, but they're not counted in the official statistics as being unemployed. And then when you get these numbers about each month about the jobs that have been created and the unemployment numbers coming down, it doesn't tell you what kinds of jobs are being created. And so many of those jobs are low wage or minimum wage jobs. They're part-time. So if you get a part-time job, that's counted in the jobless numbers. A lot of them are temporary or otherwise contingent. They're not the kind of jobs that you can support a family on, for example. And even before, this whole employment problem started long before the Great Recession, which actually started officially in December of 2007. I was writing columns way back in the 1990s about the waves of layoffs that came from these big companies. They wouldn't call it, they wouldn't say the employees were being fired. They would say that they were being downsized or laid off, or they had all kinds of euphemisms and stuff. So we've never recovered from that. We have just found out that the United States of America in November 2014 has reached a new record in child homelessness in this country.
Child homelessness.
Child homelessness. I mean, that's horrible. Every night in New York City, in our town, 50,000 people jam the homeless shelters every night. Tons more are turned away. Many of those are children. You know, I see them. I live on the Upper West Side. I see the homeless every morning when I come out. I'm an early riser. They're sleeping on the street. They're sleeping on church steps. They're sleeping in alleyways. We have a tragic situation here in terms of joblessness, poverty, underemployment
now,
that we're not paying nearly enough attention to.
Now, your book really makes a case for the middle class and says it's the middle class that is threatened. Now, are these homeless people whom you see, were they formerly members of the middle class?
Well, the homeless people that I see sleeping on the streets, in many cases, these are folks who have other kinds of problems, who have problems with drug addiction or alcohol abuse. You have to go into the shelters in other areas of the country if you want to talk about the people who have been suffering from unemployment or home foreclosure and that sort of thing. Many of those were, in fact, formerly middle class. But one of the things that happens with the middle class when they get hammered by home foreclosure and joblessness is not that they show up in homeless shelters. They double up with relatives and friends. So you have all kinds of people in the United States who are living with 2 or 3 families to an apartment or to a home and that sort of thing. And another thing that you have are the young people who are coming out of high school and who are coming out of college. Many of them have had to go back home and live with their families. There's been a lot of coverage about that. But also many of them, rather than getting their own apartment and beginning to get a foothold on an adult standard of living, they're living with 4 or 5 or 6 roommates and that sort of thing.
Now, that is economic dislocation, and it exists unquestionably in varying degrees. But you also write about political dislocation, and you referred to the Supreme Court with the Voting Rights Act, but then there's also the opinion on campaign contributions.
Oh, yeah.
So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. What happens is, one of the things where
Citizens United.
The Citizens United decision, yes, which basically opened the floodgates and unlimited corporate campaign contributions. One of the things that happens is that people's eyes glaze over when you start to talk about things like wealth or income inequality. It's not that they don't want to hear it, but they're just basically not interested. It's abstract. It doesn't get to, it's not fun. But these are important issues because when we have the kinds of extremes of inequality that we have in the United States now, it's not just financial inequality. it's political inequality. So the folks who have so much money have most of the say in terms of electing our public officials, and then beyond that, most importantly, in terms of policy. So, for example, you have a large majority of Americans who are in favor of an increase in the federal minimum wage. But it's so hard to get that increase because the people who have power are the people who are at or near the top, who have the money, who are worried about reduced taxes. They don't want more services for people. They don't want to pay more in taxes. So they fight against an increase in the minimum wage. And that's just one example of the kind of thing that harms people in the lower echelons of income because they don't have the same kind of political clout that the rich have.
So I suppose what the American dream is, and what Johnson was imagining, was that the working class people would enter the middle class,
Right.
and middle class people would do better.
Yes.
And the key to a lot of that is education and equipping these people that I've spoken of with appropriate skills, either intellectual or technical skills, so that they can join the workforce at a much higher level. Are we doing our job in the area of education? That's something you write about extensively in the book.
Well, I fight back against that concept somewhat. I am in favor of improved education for everyone, just simply because I think people should be more knowledgeable, and there are riches to be gained when you reach higher education levels. But I don't think that the point of education is just to get you a job, but more important than that is educating more of these folks will not get them the jobs that we claim. You don't get an employment payoff for that because there aren't enough jobs. So let's say we graduated 2 million more young men and women from college next year. They would not get 2 million more college-level jobs. They'll either be unemployed or they'll go to work, flipping burgers or working in a Starbucks or something like that. What we have seen happening, and the data bear this out, is more and more kids are coming out of college, but they're taking jobs that high school graduates and dropouts used to get. So that now you've got more and more high school graduates and dropouts being pushed down the employment ladder. So they're taking ever more menial jobs, or they're being pushed out of the workforce altogether. So education is not the answer to our employment problems. We should be in favor of increased education because it makes you a more well-rounded and generally more satisfied human being. But it's not the answer to our employment troubles.
Well, isn't a lot of the problem technological dislocation? I mean, there was the nice lady at the airport who checked you in, and now you go to a kiosk. Now her job is gone.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be recreated. It's
That's right.
not like the old days where you were laid off at the steel mill and then 6 months later they took you back.
That's exactly right.
So
And
how do we fix this?
And that's actually a much larger problem than we use the big term globalization, as though many jobs did go to India or China or whatever, but the technological advances are the ones that have really clobbered the workforce. And there is no easy answer about how to fix that, and I think that we should be paying a lot more attention to that, because we have to decide whether our advanced technological society is capable of providing enough work for all the people who want and need to work. We don't know yet whether it can or not.
But suppose it's not, what do we do?
If it's not, then we have some decisions to make, because we have to figure out what to do with the folks who get left out. So are we talking about, for example, a guaranteed annual income? Are we talking about government as the employer of last resort? We need to be seriously—
Or first and last resort.
Or first and last. We need to seriously think about what we're going to do. This is a profound issue as we get deeper and deeper into the 21st century.
Well, also our society and our economy and our politics have been undermined because we've been perpetually at war since 2001. It's cost us $3 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you write of the tremendous human toll. You write of an Army officer was the victim of an IED explosion in Iraq, and what he had to do just to be able to walk again, let alone complete his education.
Sure, that story of a young fellow named Dan Bershinsky, he was 24 years old, came out of West Point, very bright guy. He's a lieutenant in the Army. He goes to lead a platoon in Afghanistan, and just 1 month into his tour, as you point out, he steps on an IED, loses both legs. One is so high up, they call it a hip disarticulation, that the doctors told him he was unlikely to ever walk again, even with artificial limbs. His whole goal in life then shifts to be able to walk, and I tell his story as one of the threads in the book. But we lost thousands of young people in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Killed or maimed?
No, thousands killed.
Killed.
Tens of thousands maimed in those wars, and you know, no one even knows, has a real number about how many Iraqis and Afghans were killed in those wars. And then you point out there's the economic toll. I mean, Joe Stiglitz and a colleague at Harvard, Joe's at Columbia, a colleague at Harvard named Linda Bilmes wrote a book called, a few years ago, called The $3 Trillion War. They underestimated the cost of the war. They're now thinking that it's at least $4 or $5 trillion ultimately that these wars will cost. Well, we don't even pay much attention to that. We're not covering in any real sense the young men and women who are being sent into, who have been sent into combat for tour after tour. We don't discuss in any kind of significant public way how we're going to pay the cost of these wars, which essentially have been put on a credit card. And the cost of these wars and the attention that they divert from other important public issues makes it much more difficult to make the investments that would make this a stronger and economically stronger society.
So these wars have really gone a great distance to undermining the promise of the American dream.
Exactly.
In your view.
Exactly right.
Now also, you tackle the problem of our decaying infrastructure. I think Brzezinski said he flew from Beijing to Dulles, and it was like going back 40 years in time. What's to be done about this? You write of this wonderfully heroic woman, Mercedes Gordon, who was in a car over the bridge that collapsed in Minneapolis,
right.
I-35W, and how she tried to put her life together. And what a tragedy.
Yeah, this woman, I was crazy about Mercedes. She's got such courage and such a great sense of humor. She was 32 years old. She was on that I-35 bridge that collapsed into the Mississippi River. She was horribly injured. Her car landed on an embankment and slammed into a retaining wall. So she broke her back, her legs were crushed and that sort of thing. And so I chronicle her recovery from this terrible accident. And the reason, the way I got to introduced to Mercedes is that I wanted to write about infrastructure because our infrastructure is in sad shape, and if we were to rebuild it, it would be a great source of good new jobs. But if you think wealth and inequality make people's eyes glaze over, try writing about infrastructure. So I'm going, oh my goodness, how am I going to write about this? So that's when I decided, well, I'll write about the bridge collapse because it's a dramatic story. So I got to Mercedes. But what we don't know very well, because they don't really get covered, are the number of disasters that are infrastructure related.
Train wrecks.
So train wrecks, and you know, our electrical grid is not in good shape, so we have these big storms, and then the lights go out. We saw what happened on the East Coast with Hurricane, was that Sandy?
Sandy, Superstorm Sandy.
Superstorm Sandy. So, and our airports compared to other places are in terrible shape. The subway system, it's a remarkable system here in New York City. I can't imagine what the city would be like without it, but that subway system was made at the turn of the, was developed at the turn of the 20th century. It hasn't really been modernized, you know. So if we were to have a...
Or adequately looked after, it you go to Tokyo, as I recently did, and ride the subways. I mean, you could literally eat off the floor.
Isn't that something?
It's just unbelievable how well kept it is.
Right.
And why can't we do that?
We could do that. You know, we have to make investments, and it's important because the politicians talk about spending, and they make it sound like you're just flushing the money away. investments mean that there's going to be a payoff down the line. If we made these investments in infrastructure or the proper investments in education, for example, you would end up with a more prosperous country. Millions and millions of individuals and families would benefit.
Well,
But you have to think long term in order to do that.
A lot of people have taken a stab at our educational system. Most notably Bill Gates, who said, well, we could have smaller schools, and he had a program for that, and that didn't work.
We went down the wrong road on education with these corporate reforms. Yeah, you mentioned the Bill Gates Smaller Schools Initiative, which lasted for several years in the early part of the 21st century. He thought that the problem with our high schools was that they were too big, so we turned them into these smaller academies, invested billions of dollars in that. And then it turned out that didn't work. He acknowledged that it was a failure. And then
what about charter schools?
We've all seen charter schools were a good idea to begin with because they were going to be experimental, but they were supposed to work cooperatively with the traditional public schools, so that when you had experiments in the charter schools that worked, you were supposed to expand it to the system as a whole. Instead, what the corporations have done, and these giant foundations, is set up charter schools in competition with public schools. So they take resources away from public schools. That's not from the traditional public schools, because charter schools are still public schools. That's not a good idea. Why do you want to take resources away from schools that are educating our children? So.
Well, there is a cap in the city of New York on charter schools, and Merrill Tisch, who is the state chancellor, wants to raise the cap. So do you agree with her? We should have more charter schools?
No, I think that we need to stop and take a look at what's working with charter schools and what's not working with charter schools. Just so I'm not opposed to charter schools per se, but I don't want the charter schools. Charter schools in the United States educate only a very small percentage of the public school population. Something like 90% of American kids go to traditional public schools, not charter schools. So the idea of heaping all these resources on schools that only educate a small percentage of the kids doesn't seem to make sense to me. So let's look at the charter schools, find out the things that are working well that we could expand and do that. And the charter schools that are not working, that were a bad idea to begin with, or that are going down the wrong road, close them, shut them down.
You are kind of pessimistic that we can do this through our political system, because you say that's controlled by the moneyed class and by large contributions. And you invoke the history of the 1960s, where larger and larger numbers of people sat in to protest segregation, and they eventually had their day and they won. So what can we do now to implement some of these reforms that you advocate?
I am discouraged in terms of looking toward our political leadership to get us out of the fix that we're in. I just don't think that they're going to do it. Either party, Democrats or Republicans. I mean, everybody who's read my work over the years know that I'm very liberal in terms of my politics, but I don't think the Democrats. I don't think that the Democrats or the Republicans are going to get us out of this fix. What I think we need is a movement bubbling up from below, and I'd like to see it focused on employment. I think employment is the most important issue facing our country. If you have the kind of economy that we have, it's a capitalist consumer economy, then people need to have good jobs in order to have a decent standard of living, and that's what we don't have. If you had a movement that was focused on the creation, the development of decent employment for everyone who wants and needs to work, then the politicians, if the movement was large enough and powerful enough, then the politicians would have no choice but to pay attention. And my argument in the book is that when in the early days of the civil rights movement, people thought this was pie in the sky. They didn't think that the country could be changed in the profound ways that we have seen it changed. Same thing in the early days of the labor movement. Same thing with the women's movement. I remember back in the late 60s and early 70s, the feminists were ridiculed. That's the only kind of coverage they got. People thought that their behavior was preposterous. Well, they didn't give up. It was not preposterous. And look how quality of life for women has changed in this country over those several decades. So I think that we need something similar in the area of employment in this country.
So if you could do one thing today so that we could find our way in the 21st century, what would you do?
Oh, that's actually an easy question for me, and that is that you need more and more ordinary people engaged in the important issues of our time. So we just had a wave election in which the Republicans were very successful, but only about 36% of eligible voters actually bothered to go cast a ballot. You can't change a country for the better. I mean, that's not even a real democracy. You can't change a country for the better if only a little more than a third of the people are going to vote.
More and more people engaged.
People have to vote and have to become more engaged.
More engaged. That's the answer. So, Bob Herbert, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jim. I appreciate it.
Just fabulous.
That's terrific.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. Please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. All the best.